The man known to history as Adolf Hitler was born on the 20th of April 1889 in the then Austro-Hungarian town of Braunau am Inn, close to the southern border with Germany. His father, Alois Hitler, was a custom civil servant and was by all accounts an overbearing, strict and domineering man who had changed his name from Schicklgruber to Hitler in 1877. In contrast, Adolf's mother Clara was a kind and gentle woman who had initially been hired as a servant by Alois, but after the death of his second wife, he took the much younger Clara as his third in 1885, and the two then went on to parent 6 children, only 2 of which, Adolf and his sister Paula, survived childhood. The deaths of so many of her children no doubt shaped Clara's close relationship with her only surviving son, who she came to dote over and protect, as she understandably feared for his well-being and would often smother him in affection after his father's regular thrashings. In return, Clara was perhaps the only person that Adolf Hitler ever truly loved, and he would go on to carry her picture on his person until the very end of his life. In 1900, Adolf's younger brother Edmund died from the measles, which was a particularly severe blow for the family, and 3 years later, when his father also died, Adolf's performance at school deteriorated markedly, and he became increasingly solemn and detached. An average student, Hitler then went through several schools, making few friends, and despite being idle and often insolent to his teachers, eventually passed his exams, but as yet did not have a clear idea of what he wanted to do with his life. After school, Adolf seems to have taken little responsibility for himself, instead choosing to live in comfort with his mother, spending his days with drawing, painting, and attending the local opera, with seemingly little or no desire to fledge the nest and make his own way in the world. Finally, at the age of 18, Hitler, who had still never had a job and whose mother was undergoing treatment for breast cancer, chose to leave home and moved to the Austrian capital, where he applied to the Vienna School of Fine Arts and was, after taking the entrance exam, rejected. This career setback, which Hitler had not expected in his wildest dreams, then turned into outright tragedy and despair when in 1907 his beloved mother died of breast cancer, which was no doubt a devastating blow, and the family's doctor would later state that he had never seen anyone so overcome with grief. After his mother's funeral, Hitler returned to Vienna, but instead of doing everything he could to obtain a decent income, remained unemployed, spending his time reading, painting, or attending performances of Richard Wagner's operas. In 1908, Hitler once again applied to join the Academy of Fine Art, but was rejected out of hand, not even being allowed to sit in the entrance exam, and afterwards moved to new lodgings in the Austrian capital. By 1909, filled with self-doubt, resentment, and depression, Hitler became a tramp, spending his nights in homeless shelters and his days wandering aimlessly around Vienna between soup kitchens, until he finally started to sell his paintings as postcards to earn a living. However, Adolf would often sell his paintings to Jewish businessmen, with whom he was, according to accounts, on good terms, and there is no reliable evidence to believe Hitler's later assertions that he formed his anti-Jewish and Bolshevik views at this time. We do know that Hitler was a lover of Germanic culture from an early age. Therefore, living in the ancient city of Vienna, which was populated with many different ethnic groups and nationalities from all 4 corners of Austria's empire, may have affected his opinions on non-German speaking people. As well as this, Hitler came to resent the Austrian government itself for its policy of integration towards foreigners, who he felt were better treated than the native population. This increasing disdain of the country of his birth, combined with him receiving his share of his father's inheritance at the age of 24, as well as his desire to avoid military service, then prompted him to leave Vienna and move to Munich in 1913, where he continued his profession of the painting of postcards. After the outbreak of the First World War, Hitler, despite being a foreigner, was allowed to enlist in the German army, in which he served as a dispatch runner and was involved in various battles such as the Somme, Arras, and Passchendaele on the Western Front, mostly against British forces. He was decorated for bravery on various occasions, ultimately receiving the prestigious Iron Cross, Second Class, and later First Class, which he was nominated for by his Jewish commanding officer. Hitler then suffered a bout of blindness due to mustard gas exposure in August 1918, which then resulted in him spending the remainder of the war recuperating in hospital. Starved, exhausted, and rampant with socialist uprisings, Germany surrendered 3 months later, much to Hitler's disbelief, as just prior to his hospitalization, the country had seemed to be on the verge of victory. He would later blame this defeat on radical elements within Germany, such as the Jews and the communists, that had in his mind weakened the state from within, although in reality, the blame must lie with the German Kaiser, High Command, and in particular, Erich Ludendorff, who would coincidentally become Hitler's political ally during his later failed putsch attempt. The myth that an international conspiracy was behind Germany's defeat had also been fueled by the Russian Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917, which in reality had been facilitated by the German High Command itself, who had allowed Vladimir Lenin to return to Russia earlier that year. In short, it was far easier for those of a nationalistic persuasion to blame the outsider, or enemy within, than to consider the possibility that Germany had been defeated in a fair fight, and Hitler, who himself was incapable of self-criticism, later latched onto this myth and thusly determined to make those responsible pay. In 1919, Munich and Bavaria as a whole became a hotbed of communist agitation, which eventually led to the Bavarian Revolution in April, after which a Soviet Republic was set up, which was shortly afterwards overthrown. Hitler had around this time been assigned as a guard of a prisoner of war camp, and after it was disbanded, was then assigned to guard a train station in Munich's city centre. Records during this period name him as his company's representative to the ruling communist regime, and after the Soviet Republic of Bavaria had been proclaimed in April of 1919, he continued to represent his company and liaise with the revolutionary movement. After the collapse of the Soviet regime in Bavaria, Hitler remained in the much reduced German army, but was now posted to a counter-revolutionary intelligence unit in which he would be tasked with gathering information on the area's various radical political groups. Before the commencement of his duties, Hitler was sent to Munich University, where he attended an army-funded course on German history, the political situation, and most importantly public speaking, which were designed to educate informants in the necessities of combating the region's far-left revolutionary movements. It was this education more than anything that formed Adolf Hitler's right-wing political views after World War I, as it was the increasingly widespread hostility within Bavaria towards the far left, along with his new education and position, that would present him with the opportunity and audience to kickstart his political career. Soon after this, Hitler was noticed by one of his superiors having a heated debate with one of his colleagues, which in turn led, because of his debating skills, to him being promoted and tasked with giving lectures to troops within the army, who had been identified as having Marxist sympathies. Hitler also started to air his anti-Semitic views around this time, which he would later merge with his anti-communist sentiments to form his worldview, which was largely of a far-right nationalistic outlook, opposed to the pernicious outside influences such as Jews, Marxists, and the Versailles Treaty that he had felt had undermined Germany and caused or perpetuated its downfall. Then, on the 12th of September 1919, Hitler attended a meeting of the tiny and seemingly innocently named German Workers' Party, and either by his own instigation or after being ordered by his army superiors, joined the movement as member 555. He then rose rapidly within the movement, in which he gave rabble-rousing speeches in Munich's beer halls, leading to him before long effectively becoming the party's figurehead, even eclipsing its leader, Anton Drexler. A common conception is that Hitler's political views were already fully formed at this stage. However, it is far more likely that he, whilst giving speeches, observed the reactions of his audience, and over time, played on any subjects or viewpoints which got a reaction, and simply dropped any viewpoints which got no reaction or were unpopular. In short, Hitler did not invent anti-Semitism in Germany. He merely rode the wave of public opinion, amplifying and projecting it to gain notoriety and power. In 1921, members of the newly renamed National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party Executive Committee, put forward a motion to merge with the rival German Socialist Party, and Hitler, fearing he would lose influence, immediately resigned in protest, which caused a panic due to the fact that he was by this time the key figure in the movement, and him leaving would potentially spell doom for the party. Essentially, Hitler, whose life would be shaped by high-risk gambles, correctly calculated that the party could not afford to lose its star performer, and after Drexler cancelled the merger, Hitler stated that he would only rejoin on the condition he was made party chairman, leading to a vote being taken, which he overwhelmingly won. Now in full control, the leader, or Führer as Hitler was now known, escalated his speeches and public appearances, and soon became a recognized political figure within Bavaria and beyond. Then, in 1923, Hitler appealed to the former head of Germany's armed forces, Erich Ludendorff, who had been one of the key architects of the myth of the enemy from within, to aid him in a coup to seize power of the Bavarian government. The aging general agreed to join with the former corporal, and, on the 8th of November 1923, Hitler and his followers stormed into a public meeting being held by the head of the Bavarian government, Gustav von Kahr, at which Hitler proclaimed that a revolution had begun. The next day, Hitler and his followers, which included Rudolf Hess, Hermann Göring, Ernst Röhm, and the unknown Heinrich Himmler, attempted to seize the Bavarian War Ministry, but after troops arrived and opened fire on the gathered Nazis, a panic ensued and Hitler and his supporters fled the scene. Hitler was then subsequently arrested and tried for high treason in February of 1923 and was given 5 years in prison at Landsberg, along with several other ringleaders of the putsch, including Rudolf Hess, but Ludendorff was released without charge. Whilst at Landsberg prison, Hitler wrote one of the most inflammatory and notorious books of the 20th century, Mein Kampf, which was part autobiography, part political doctrine, in which he laid out his ideas for a racially pure Germany, as well as his hatred of Marxism. On the 20th of December 1924, Hitler was pardoned and released from prison, and immediately retook control of the Nazi Party. But as the German economy was now in good health, and also recognizing that taking power through violence had been counterproductive, Hitler decided to now seek to gain control of Germany via political or peaceful means. However, between May 1924 and 1928, Hitler's popularity only diminished, as he secured only 800,000 votes in 1928, as opposed to nearly 2 million votes 4 years earlier, meaning that obscurity and failure seemed certain. Then, in October 1929, the Wall Street crash sent the world's economy into turmoil, and because Germany's economy was comparatively weaker than most, as it still had massive debts, inflation skyrocketed, in turn resulting in mass unemployment and food shortages throughout the country. This more than anything else gave Hitler and his Nazi party the ammunition they needed to seize power, and as the population got more and more desperate, the Führer stepped up his campaigning, utilizing modern technology such as aircraft, which enabled him to make speeches in several different cities in a day during the increasingly frequent national elections. This, along with the ever-growing public presence of the Nazi Party in the shape of its brown shirts, or the SA, firmly catapulted Hitler onto the national stage, which combined with the widespread unrest led to his vote share increasing as he promised the German people bread and work, which seemed like manna from heaven at the time. This state of crisis, combined with the increasingly regular elections, then led to a hung parliament within the Reichstag, meaning that no political party had a majority or overall control. This deadlock then prompted leading politicians to write to the head of state, Paul von Hindenburg, in which they recommended he appoint Hitler as Chancellor, and after 2 further elections in which no party claimed an outright majority, Hindenburg did so, culminating in Adolf Hitler being made Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January, 1933. After this, Hitler immediately sought to claim total control of the country and asked Hindenburg to dissolve parliament so that fresh elections could be held in March. However, a month later in February of 1933, the Reichstag caught fire and burned to the ground, after which Hindenburg at Hitler's insistence enacted the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended all basic civil rights and allowed detention without trial. The Nazis had been quick to blame the far left for the fire, which led to the German Communist Party being all but shut down over the coming months, even though the National Socialists and Hitler himself had gained the most from the incident. Next, the Reichstag met at the Kroll Opera House and voted on an enabling act which gifted Hitler de facto control over Germany for the period of 4 years and enabled him to pass laws without the consent of the country's parliament. In voting for this act, the Reichstag effectively signed its own death warrant, as the bill's passing made Hitler the dictator of Germany in all but name, meaning that German democracy was now dead. Over the coming months, all political opposition was crushed throughout the country, as its political parties were forced to shut down, and any persons who were considered any kind of threat were interned, either in prisons or in the newly constructed concentration camps that were now springing up throughout Germany. Hitler now began an ambitious plan to rebuild and rejuvenate the country's economy by cancelling austerity and instigating by means of loans a massive public works program, which in turn slashed the country's unemployment figures. Only 2 obstacles now stood between the Führer and absolute power in Germany, one of which was Hindenburg, who was still technically Hitler's superior, and the second was the army, or rather the Army High Command, who were now increasingly voicing their concerns regarding Ernst Röhm's now massive SA, or brown shirts. The SA had been set up as the fighting arm of the National Socialist Party to fight back against its communist opponents during the 1920s, but by this time numbered in the millions and was far larger than the German army. Reacting to the ever-increasing numbers of complaints about the SA's often brutal methods, Hindenburg told Hitler he had to rein in the SA and its leader, Ernst Röhm, who was now a direct threat to the army, the government, and to Hitler himself. Plans were then set in motion with Hitler's approval to permanently muzzle the SA in an operation codenamed Hummingbird, which was headed by Hermann Göring, the head of the SS Heinrich Himmler, along with his right-hand man, Reinhard Heydrich. The operation was then carried out from the 30th of June to the 2nd of July 1934, in which arrests were made throughout the country, leading to dozens of the Nazis' political enemies, including the leaders of the SA, being arrested and executed without trial. Amongst them were the SA leader, Ernst Röhm, and Hitler's political opponents coming from all corners of the political spectrum, including Ritter von Kahr, the former leader of the Bavarian government, who was dragged into a wood by 2 SS men and hacked to death with axes. In essence, Hitler used this operation, which became known as the Night of the Long Knives, to eliminate any and all opponents both from within and without the Nazi Party, which simultaneously appeased the demands of Paul von Hindenburg and the Army High Command. Then, on the 2nd of August 1934, Hindenburg died, and after he was given a lavish state funeral by the Nazi regime, Hitler acted to remove the final obstacle between him gaining supreme power by making himself head of state, after which he had the German army swear personal allegiance to him. This meant that Hitler, after little more than a year of being made Chancellor, had unrivaled control over every single aspect of German life, and was now the Führer of the entire German nation. Germany was now National Socialist Germany. The Third Reich had begun. Over the coming 4 years, more and more money was poured into Germany's infrastructure, industry, and its armed forces, whose numbers were swelled by the recruitment of hundreds of thousands of SA members, many of whom had been forced, after the Night of the Long Knives, to either join Heinrich Himmler's SS or now the much larger German Army, or Wehrmacht. Germany was rearming. New aircraft, new tanks, new guns, but by this time, the old enemies of France and Britain had begun to take notice of the growing threat, as certain voices within those nations had started to warn their governments of what may lay ahead. But, despite these warnings, many people didn't want to imagine another European war. Only a madman could want such a thing, and there was still no certainty about the Führer's future intentions. Indeed, his rejuvenation of the German economy was greatly admired and praised throughout the world. For the time being, the nations of the world watched and hoped for the best, because they didn't, or couldn't, countenance the worst, as it was too terrible to contemplate. But as time passed and the warning signs grew, so did the calls for France and Britain to act against Germany before things went too far. Hitler then turned his attention to his native country of Austria, as there were growing calls from the nationalist supporters of the Nazi Party on both sides of the border for the countries to unite. The Führer then exerted pressure on the Austrian government to allow the union, but after meeting resistance from them, gave the country's government an ultimatum on the 11th of March for all those who so desired to be allowed to cross the border into Germany. However, after the Austrians continually stalled for time, Hitler's patience deserted him, and he then ordered the Wehrmacht to cross the border into Austria on the morning of the 12th of March, 1938. After opposition in the Führer's homeland had melted away, he embarked on a celebratory tour of the country, in which he crossed the border by motorcade, along with a heavily armed 4,000-strong SS bodyguard, after which he passed through his hometown of Braunau, before working his way towards Vienna, where he was met by hundreds of thousands of cheering people. This meant that the Führer's first great strategic gamble had paid off, and as the Western powers had done nothing to intervene in his annexation of Austria, Hitler, who was now emboldened with a new sense of confidence, turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. Pressure was then exerted on the Czech government for the Sudetenland areas of the country, which contained a sizable population of German-speaking people, to be handed over to German control. However, the British and the French pressured the Germans to back off, but at the Munich conference, they signed an agreement allowing Germany to occupy the Sudetenland on the condition Hitler made no more territorial claims in the continent. The territory was handed over to the Germans on the 29th of September, 1938, but Hitler was still not satisfied with the agreement and subsequently ordered the Wehrmacht to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia the following spring, which broke the Munich agreement between himself, France, and Britain. There was now no doubt that Hitler was a man who could not be trusted and who wanted war at any price. Therefore, the major powers started to rearm in earnest, as war was now inevitable. Germany now began to prepare for an invasion of Poland, the reasons for which were down to Hitler wanting to reclaim the German territory of West Prussia, which had been handed over to Poland after World War I, and now separated Germany from East Prussia. Another reason for the invasion of Poland was the Führer's long-held assertion that Germany needed more living space in Eastern Europe for colonization, or as he called it, Lebensraum. However, Before attacking the Poles, Germany needed to secure an agreement with the Soviet Union to avoid any possible conflict over the country. So, on the 23rd of August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, which stipulated that Poland would be divided between them. This pushed Europe to the very brink of war, and led 2 days after the German-Soviet agreement was signed to Britain and Poland signing their own Anglo-Polish alliance, in which Britain guaranteed Polish independence. Hitler again gambled after this, as he calculated that Britain would be unwilling to commit to another European war, and thusly gave the invasion the go-ahead regardless, which then began on the 1st of September 1939, when German troops crossed the Polish border en masse. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany in response. World War II had begun. Poland, despite brave resistance, was no match for Germany, which, using a combination of tanks and mechanized infantry, along with close air support from Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe, quickly pounded the country into submission, and on the 17th of September, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland, carving the country in two. What followed is now known as the Phony War, as Britain and France hesitated, deciding not to attack, which gave Hitler time to build up his forces on Germany's western border, and after the fall of Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940, the Führer ordered the invasion of Holland, Belgium, and France itself. On the 10th of May 1940, Army Group B in the north advanced through the Low Countries of Holland and Belgium, which forced the British and French armies to advance to meet them. This pinned the Allies in the north, whilst to the south, in the heavily forested Ardennes region, which had been judged to be impassable to tanks by the Allied leadership, the main force of the German army advanced. Army Group A then smashed straight through the poorly defended French lines and raced towards the Channel ports, cutting the Allied armies in two and leaving Paris open to direct assault. This brilliant manoeuvre sent the Allies into outright panic, and after various sporadic counterattacks failed, and being surrounded on all sides, the British decided to withdraw from France in what became known as the Dunkirk Evacuation. With the British now neutralised, the Germans turned their attention towards Paris, and under massive pressure, the French declared the city open, leading to it being occupied by the Wehrmacht on the 14th of June 1940. 8 days later, on the 22nd of June, delegates from the French government under the newly instated Marshal Pétain met their German counterparts, including Hitler, at Compiègne, in the very same railway carriage which in 1918 the Germans had surrendered to the Allies. Hitler then toured Paris on the 24th of June via motorcade, visiting Napoleon's tomb and the Eiffel Tower, along with the city's other landmarks, in what would prove to be his only visit to the French capital. In a matter of weeks, Germany had defeated France and delivered Britain a crushing blow, making Hitler the master of Europe and a national hero, as he had erased the shame and defeat of the First World War and claimed revenge on the country's enemies. However, Britain refused to enter peace talks as its new Prime Minister Winston Churchill was determined, despite detractors within his own government, not to give in to Hitler, and thusly resolved to continue the struggle to the bitter end. Hermann Göring had assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe alone was strong enough to defeat the British Royal Air Force to facilitate a cross-channel invasion, and Hitler, who had no reason to doubt Göring at this stage, gave the go-ahead for the aerial assault, which began on the 10th of July 1940, with mass air raids on targets in southern England, including airfields and radar installations. These attacks and aerial battles continued with massive losses on both sides, until on the 2nd of August, an RAF bombing raid over Berlin, which was intended to hit industrial targets, accidentally dropped its payload on residential areas, largely due to heavy cloud cover. Hitler, who was outraged, then ordered Göring to bomb London in reprisal, which shifted the focus away from the now near-disabled airfields across southern England and allowed the RAF valuable time to recoup its depleted numbers. The Luftwaffe then continued its bombing of civilian targets, as did the RAF, until in October 1940, acknowledging the British defences were still too strong to make an invasion viable, Hitler cancelled Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, judging the country to be no serious threat, and turned his attention eastwards towards Russia. Hitler had long hated Bolshevism and stated that the Soviet Union was a backwards ramshackle state which was ripe for the picking, and thusly ordered the German High Command to draw up plans for a full-scale invasion of the country, which was codenamed Operation Redbeard or Barbarossa, after the Teutonic king that had fought the Slavs in the Middle Ages. Barbarossa was to become the largest ground invasion in human history, consisting of nearly 3 million German troops in 3 massive army thrusts. The 3 armies consisted of Army Group North, Centre and South, the strongest of which was the Army Group Centre, which was tasked initially at driving through the heart of the Soviet Union towards Moscow. Army Group North, on the other hand, was tasked with capturing Leningrad on the Baltic coast and then driving south to support the push on Moscow, whilst Army Group South was tasked with capturing the Ukraine and its capital Kiev. Hitler then gave the invasion the go-ahead, and on the morning of the 22nd of June 1941, German troops flung themselves at the stunned Soviet defences. Initially all went well, with millions of Russian troops being massacred or captured in huge encircling manoeuvres, and it seemed only a matter of time before the Soviet Union as a whole would collapse. Stalin himself was so shocked by the invasion that he locked himself away for days, meaning that no orders were issued to the front, as his military leaders were terrified of making a wrong decision and incurring Stalin's wrath, meaning that the entire Russian army was effectively crippled for weeks. Over the coming months, the Germans continued to advance, but were increasingly held up by both long supply lines and the fact that the majority of the German infantry still had to move from A to B by using horses. Hitler then began to become concerned by the sheer massive numbers of tanks and infantry the Germans were coming up against, as well as the sheer toughness and bravery of the Soviet troops, whose determination to resist seemed to grow the more the Germans advanced rather than weaken. When the autumn rain of 1941 came, the Russian dirt tracks down which the Germans were advancing turned into quagmires, resulting in the advance grinding to a halt, which only continued again when the ground started to freeze with the onset of winter. However, the German army and war effort was only geared to conduct short, decisive wars, which combined with its troops not being equipped with winter clothing, soon meant that the advance shuddered to a halt once again. In short, Hitler's impatience in invading Russia quickly and not preparing for the winter conditions made matters 10 times worse, as men and horses literally froze solid in the sub-zero temperatures, and the German vehicles, unlike the Soviet vehicles, ran largely on petrol, which turned to jelly in low temperatures, whilst diesel, on the other hand, remained a liquid. The German army then, after failing to capture Moscow in December 1941, was forced to dig in for the winter, which in turn gave the Soviets, who after all were accustomed to the severe cold, all the time they needed to regroup and resupply. It was around this time that another influence began to take its toll on Hitler, as his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, who was considered a quack by his peers, but who had been appointed to the post after curing Hitler's stomach cramps, began to administer the Führer with powerful and dangerous combinations of hard drugs. These included methamphetamine, which would often make Hitler hyperactive and cause him to stay up late into the night, often until past 3 in the morning, meaning that to counteract this, Morell gave Hitler bromnervicid, a powerful bromide-based sedative, which would in turn knock Hitler out completely and cause him to sleep well into the next day. This combination of uppers and downers no doubt had a considerable detrimental effect on Hitler's ability to make coherent decisions regarding the war in Russia, and may in part explain many of his irrational strategic choices later in the conflict. One of the Führer's more fateful mistakes was his insistence as the war went on in making all the major strategic decisions himself. Joseph Stalin, in contrast, who had not trusted his generals to command his armies early in the war, eventually allowed the experts to do their jobs, and essentially gave his commanders the freedom they needed to conduct the war themselves. This is certainly one of the most important factors in Germany's eventual defeat in the East, as Hitler, like Stalin, had little or no knowledge of military command, but unlike the Soviet leader, gradually wrestled control of his armies away from his generals, with disastrous consequences. Also, in early 1942, SS leaders met at Wannsee, near Berlin, in a meeting which was chaired by Himmler's second-in-command, the ice-cold and ruthless Reinhard Heydrich. At this meeting, Heydrich and other leader Nazis thrashed out the details of what became known as the final solution to the Jewish question, resulting in millions of Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals being transported across Europe to massive death camps in which they were gassed and incinerated. This also placed a massive strain on the German economy, as thousands of troops and millions of Reichmarks were needed to organize and build the camps required, and goes to illustrate the lengths the Nazis went to meet their fanatical ends, as even though the final solution severely depleted Germany's limited resources, Hitler, Himmler, and Heydrich still continued with their plans to exterminate the Jews, despite the resources the Holocaust required being badly needed on the fighting fronts. In the spring of 1942, the Germans resumed their eastern offensive, but by this time, Japan had attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, which led to Hitler declaring war on the United States in support of his ally. This was another colossal mistake, as it meant America's massive industrial potential was now unleashed, and also meant that Germany was now at war with another major power on 4 fronts. These included Russia, the ever-increasing bombing and counter-bombing against Britain, the struggle to disrupt Allied shipping in the North Atlantic, and North Africa, where Germany had intervened after Mussolini's failed invasion of Egypt had meant that the British were in danger of dominating the Mediterranean. All this combined with ramping up of the final solution stretched Germany's industry to breaking point, and it was now only a matter of time before its troops and industry were worn down. In 1942, the German army continued to advance into Russia, extending its supply lines and meeting ever-increasing numbers of Russian troops and tanks in the process. Leningrad was at this time surrounded by Army Group North, but Army Group Center to the southeast had failed in its attempt to take Moscow and was slowly being pushed back by Soviet counterattacks. Hitler now turned his attention south to the Crimea, or rather the oil fields in the Baku region, and during the remainder of that year, the Germans attempted to seek a knockout blow in the south. The Führer then ordered that Stalingrad, an industrial city on the river Volga, was to be taken, which only served to weaken his drive into the Crimea, and also resulted over the coming months in one of the most bloody and intense battles in military history taking place. The city then quickly became a meat grinder, as both sides poured tens of thousands of troops into it, but as the Germans were the weaker in numbers, the Soviets were able to launch a counterattack in November of 1942, which cut through the weakened German lines to the north and south of the city. As the German army inside Stalingrad was now cut off, the Luftwaffe attempted to airdrop supplies to maintain them, but the Russians continued to tighten the noose, and after an attempt to break through to the city failed, the German 6th Army was forced to surrender in February of 1943, meaning that Hitler had lost around 750,000 troops in a single battle. This was a crushing blow to the Germans and to Hitler himself, and from this point onwards, the war in the East from a German perspective was one of defeat and withdrawal, interrupted by desperate counterattacks such as the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, which was one of the largest tank battles in the history of warfare. This battle cost the Germans hundreds of thousands of troops and was Hitler's last serious offensive against the Soviet Union in the East, as its failure meant that the fate of Germany and the Führer himself was all but sealed. By 1943, the Americans and the British had taken North Africa and were now invading Sicily, meaning that the clock was ticking, and Hitler, as a consequence, became more and more desperate and irrational in his decisions, often ordering his troops to die fighting and forbidding withdrawal. The final nail in the coffin came on the 6th of June 1944, with the Allied landings on D-Day, and as Hitler was asleep when the invasion started, no orders were issued to the front around Normandy until later that day, which effectively handed victory to the Allies. Paris then fell to the Americans shortly afterwards, and the German army began to crumble under the pressure, as the Third Reich's industrial centres, along with many of its cities, had now been flattened by the relentless Allied bombing. Hitler now resorted to sacking general after general, as he had lost all confidence in them, even though he had been the head of the armed forces since December 1941 and made all the major strategic decisions himself, despite having limited experience or knowledge. This downward spiral continued, and various attempts were made on Hitler's life, including the infamous bomb attack undertaken by Klaus von Stauffenberg at the Führer's eastern headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, on the 20th of June 1944, which only compounded his paranoia and mistrust of virtually everyone around him, and also severely damaged his fragile health. By the spring of 1945, Berlin itself was surrounded, and Hitler was now a quivering wreck of a man, showing the early symptoms of Parkinson's disease or possibly drug withdrawal. He then chose to marry his long-term mistress, Eva Braun, on the 28th or 29th of April 1945, who had been by his side since the mid-1930s and who was 23 years his junior. Then, at around 1 PM on the 30th of April 1945, Hitler locked himself inside his private chambers within the Führer bunker under the Reich Chancellery Gardens in Berlin, and a few moments later, a gunshot was heard. The door was opened, and Hitler was found dead. He had shot himself in the right temple with a pistol, whilst simultaneously biting into a cyanide capsule, whilst Eva Braun, who was slumped on the sofa next to Hitler, had also taken cyanide. In his 56 years of life, Adolf Hitler went from being a tramp to becoming the most powerful man on earth in 1940, to destroying the country he loved and everything he had fought for over his career. He had, in his early life, been little more than a wastrel who was only given the chance of notoriety by chance happenings, and after gaining that notoriety, played on the prejudices of the German people to seize power and later conduct a war he had neither the resources, intellect, or talent to win. He is regarded as being responsible for both the Second World War and the Holocaust, which combined led to the deaths of upwards of 50 million people, and we owe a massive debt to the soldiers and resistance members of all nations who fought against him and his ideas.